Despite the many potential hazards presented by some of the world's most treacherous places, this still doesn't stop many humans from risking their lives to explore them. Many of these people have a deep passion for what they do, and this passion, for the most part, outweighs any potential dangers that these ventures may pose to their lives. And it's their willingness to go where most wouldn't dare that continues to contribute to much of the knowledge that we've amassed about these lesser known and lesser explored parts of our planet.
So far this morning, the rivers started off pretty intense.
In April of 2007, experienced expedition paddlers Ben Stooksbury, Chris Korbulik, and Hendrik Kotzia decided to take on a nearly impossible feat.
One place remained out of reach: the legendary Congo region of Africa. Civil wars and dangerous wildlife make the area nearly impossible to explore. When Ben was given the rare chance to go, he prepared for the worst case scenarios. But how do you prepare yourself for the loss of a close friend?
Despite knowing the potential risks and dangers of this particular venture, the men were, regardless of this, set on testing the limits of their capabilities, and were furthermore confident that they were prepared for the worst, if it came down to it.
On expeditions like this, you do your best to prepare for the worst. But no matter how much you've prepared, when the worst happens, when you lose someone, nobody's ever ready for it.
We've heard firsthand accounts of crocodile attacks in this particular river, but the bank maybe has just as much danger as the river itself with hippos. Murchison Falls National Park is host to this amazing array of wildlife, from lions to elephants to giraffes, pretty much all the big five, but also a huge concentration of crocodiles. It's super dangerous from when you put the boat on the water to when you take it off. But we weren't just like, let's go. It's like, we can let the hippos know that we're there. We can stay quiet and sneak past the crocodiles. Like, there were things that we could do to really mitigate that risk. And for us, it was a rite of passage.
Despite this bold claim, however, little did the trio realize the reality of just how probable a worst-case scenario was in this particular stretch of river.
If you said no to Murchison Falls, the trip's over, really. And so sometimes you have to say yes, even if you feel so scared.
It is also worth mentioning that the population of crocs in the Lukuga region had risen dramatically as a result of bloody skirmishes that occurred in 15 years of fighting. Up to 5.4 million people are estimated to have been killed during the Civil War, many of whose bodies were dumped into the rivers. This in turn has said to have caused the river's crocs to develop a taste for human flesh. The day of the expedition has now arrived.
It's gorgeous out right now.
Doesn't it just?
The men gear up, do some last-minute preparations, and finally set off on their epic journey.
We wanted to run the headwaters of the Nile River towards this last stretch of the Congo that would complete the source-to-sea descent that Henry had started, connecting the dots with stretches of those rivers.
We'd be coming out, going across there.
There was a lot of talk about risk, from having clean water all the way to dangerous wildlife in the river.
The trio managed to complete the Ruzizi River part of their journey incident-free, and things went quite smoothly, as per all accounts. Well, at least as smooth as can be, given the circumstances.
And all of a sudden, this most significant anxiety just disappears into the singular focus of one moment to the next. Feeling like every single movement you make counts.
The men then spend the night of December 5th at an IRC guest house in Kalemi before taking on the Lukuga. As the man enjoyed some Tanzanian waragi, a kind of local moonshine, Hendrik was entertaining Chris and Ben with a few of his father's horror stories from his experiences during the war in Angola. The next day now arrives.
Being a kayaker in Central Africa, inevitably you're gonna have crocs in the river.
Nile crocodiles are huge. They can be up to 20 feet long, and they'll hunt you They often hide underwater, waiting to strike. And if a crocodile attacks you, there's nothing you can do.
We were much more likely to see a crocodile in a very, very flat river with no current.
So this is the start of the supermarket.
So the supermarket is where the crocs hang out in order to feed. You're the food in their supermarket.
The risk of the crocodile isn't when it's sitting on the bank in the sun. The risk is when it is in the water and you can't see it.
As a few hours go by, Chris notices a 12-foot croc on the bank, bigger than anything he'd seen thus far on the trip. He then alerts Hendrik, who quickly groups the team together and lays out the protocol. Hendrik advises the team that they must stay tight and pay close attention to the banks. He mentioned that if anybody saw a croc, they were to accelerate as a group and attempt to outrun it before it got too close. Later that night, the men stayed downriver of the village of Niemba. As they had dinner with a group of locals, the men asked the group how the IRC could help them, to which they initially responded with the obvious answer, "We need clean water and education." A small fellow then looks them straight in the eye and mentions that locals have been having a major problem with crocodiles, mentioning that 125 people had been taken from this area alone in the last 20 years.
That day started like many other days, with Henry telling us to get ready for the best day ever.
I'll interest you in one of these bad boys.
Very interested. Living the best day ever was his philosophy, and it was very much about just wanting to be nowhere else. You know, looking for this ultimate adventure in a kayak.
We were around the corner from that bridge, that village, where we were gonna resupply. But we were getting into this extra hazardous crocodile zone. We felt comfortable acknowledging that risk and continuing on.
We misunderstood the real danger that existed in that river. Henry was talking us through the experience.
Good information. Stay close.
We were able to just focus on the sound of his voice and focus on his direction in order to not get overwhelmed.
After 2 days of extreme paddling, the men then arrive at a 90-degree turn which they'd seen on Google Earth whilst mapping out their expedition routes. As Ben lagged behind the team after struggling through the last rapid, he notices Hendrik signaling him to hurry forward as Chris spotted 3 or 4 small crocs slip into the water from the riverbanks. The trio quickly grouped together as per Hendrik's protocol and begin paddling hard in an attempt to outswim the reptiles. The men aggressively paddle out for about 250 yards when all of a sudden, Chris catches a flash of motion from his peripherals. And off to the left side of Hendrik's stern and directly behind Ben, Chris turns to see a gaping pair of jaws powerfully lunge out of the water towards Hendrik's body.
I think we were on either side of him, and we look back and he just screams. And he had Croc's head that was the size of his upper body latched onto his shoulder right here. And then he was upside down and his kayak was just violently spinning. I got that sinking feeling of just knowing we couldn't do anything.
In contrast to the surface swimming crocs that most paddlers are accustomed to, this particular croc had attacked from the depths, with incredible stealth and a perfectly placed strike. The estimated 2,000-pound crocodile, who was said to have been at least 15 feet long, most likely took Hendrik to the bottom of the river, life jacket and all, and rolled him there until he drowned. What's even more horrific, Hendrik was likely conscious for the first few seconds of the attack as the croc clamped down on his chest and neck with 5,000 pounds of pressure per square inch, a bite force that remains unmatched throughout the animal kingdom. Shortly after witnessing the horrifying attack, the men then snap out of their state of shock, quickly realizing that their own lives were still at risk, at which point the men began frantically paddling back to safety. After racing downstream for a mile, the two men then alerted locals and authorities at the village of Kabea Meiji and desperately begged for a motorboat to take them back upstream. This was of course a last-ditch attempt to recover Henrique's body. To their shock and surprise, however, upon requesting a motorboat, the locals mentioned that the village no longer carried any boats, revealing that they'd given up on traveling by water after 7 locals had been snatched overboard by crocs since 2006. About 20 minutes later, the entire village, consisting of several hundred people, had gathered on a bridge overseeing the Lukuga.
Why him instead of either of us that were 2 feet away from him?
And it was during this time that Henrique's boat and paddle would float into view, with his water bottles and equipment still neatly tucked in to the center beam. In fact, the kayak was said to be in such good condition that one eyewitness of the scene had mentioned it seemed as though he had been plucked from his kayak by the hand of God. It literally looked untouched.
Watching Hendry's boat float down without him in it was the first time I had ever felt loss.
Despite intense search efforts in an attempt to salvage at least a piece of Henrique for his family, not even partial remains could be recovered, and the search was inevitably called off as a result.